Good evening and welcome to Women Talk Business. We are here tonight with Cindy Southworth, who is the Vice President of Development and Innovation at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And that's what we're going to be talking about. It's a tough subject. It has been in the news a lot lately because of the attempts to reauthorize the Violence Against Women's Act that was initially passed in 1995, I think.
1994.
And it's been up for reauthorization, and the Senate has passed it, and the U.S. House of Representatives have not. And they've got all kinds of issues with expanding coverage to immigrants and to gay and lesbian couples and all kinds of things. So it's just sort of sitting there, and it has not been reauthorized. So we thought we would do a show to actually talk about what are we talking about when we say violence against women, and what does that mean? Cindy is an internationally recognized expert, particularly in the use of technology, in how the abusers are using it, how the victims can try and protect themselves. And so we're going to have a great conversation tonight. They will put up at some point in time the call-in numbers or the email numbers so that you can send us questions if you have them, and we would be happy to try and answer them. And there it is on the screen, InsideScoop@nova.org. Send your emails there, or do a call-in at 571-749-1166. So Cindy, first of all, welcome. I appreciate you taking the time. It's rare. I've been trying to get you on for the last year and a half, and you are always traveling somewhere around the world doing something wonderful.
I'm happy to be home for a couple of weeks. It's nice.
It is nice.
And thanks for covering this really important topic. And as much as it's heavy and depressing, it's also really exciting because we've come a long way, baby.
Right.
30 or 40 years ago, we didn't have domestic violence shelters. We didn't have hotlines. We didn't have the Violence Against Women Act. So we've made a lot of progress, and we still have a long way to go.
Well, the statistics that you were showing me earlier say that 1 in 4 women will be a victim of domestic violence in their lifetime, which is a staggering statistic when you think about it.
It really is a staggering statistic when you look in any ballroom, classroom, boardroom, and you look around a group of women and think, okay, 1 in 4. At some point in her lifetime, she's going to be physically assaulted by an intimate partner. Someone who claims to love her is going to beat the tar out of her at some point in her lifetime. It doesn't mean that 1 in 4 current relationships are unhealthy, because sometimes these are high school or college relationships and someone successfully gets away and has a fabulous, loving relationship and moves on. And then there's the Yardley Love tragedies where she didn't get away.
Right.
And so, those are those, tragic stories. But it's still 1 in 4 is a staggering number, and it's not a special interest group. I mean, this is your mother, your sister, your boss. These are judges. It crosses every race, ethnicity, income, education. I've provided counseling to some of the most phenomenally successful women out there. It has nothing to do with your self-esteem, your education, or your degrees.
Well, I do want to say, because you just mentioned that you have counseled women, you have an MSW as well, so that you've got some experience in this. And despite your incredibly youthful look, you do have 21 years of experience in this field. And so you bring a wealth of knowledge to the conversation. So let's talk about, what do we mean by domestic violence? It's not simply somebody smacks you around. It's
Right.
broader than that.
And it's also not an occasionally someone loses their temper and throws a plate, because you may have a situation where someone gets upset or angry and throws something against the wall. Neither partner or party is afraid for their life. I still don't condone the behavior. It may even be illegal behavior. Breaking plates may or may not violate your state statute. However, what makes it domestic violence or intimate partner violence is the power and control, where one person is systematically choosing to misuse power and control over their partner in all parts of the day. So it's, telling them what they can wear, where they can go, who they can see, monitoring phone calls, monitoring their activities, monitoring the grocery list. I mean, it's absurd and insane, and yet it's all about maintaining control. And when you think about this, if it's an unhealthy relationship, sort of how does that differ from domestic violence? Is if I'm in a relationship, it's not going well and I want to break up and I can walk away and there's no negative consequences, it's probably not domestic violence. But if I'm terrified to break up because I'm afraid either I will die, my pet will die, or my loved ones will die, that's definitely, there's more going on there. Even if there's no physical violence today, if you're scared to break up because of harm to anybody, there's a problem.
Okay, and as you say, with like the Yardley Love situation, that was just phenomenally horrible, and if you look at it afterwards and think, why didn't somebody do something? Why didn't somebody step in?
I'm looking forward to once the trial is over, the sentencing is over, and once the students can start talking. Because one of the things about college settings, and especially in any sports group, is that everybody trains together, they sleep together, they party together, they travel together. Her teammates knew she was in danger, and I'm pretty sure his teammates knew he was a danger to her, and they probably didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to intervene, they didn't know who to tell, they didn't know what to do, and I think we have a long way to go to help sort of equip everybody that it's everyone's business. If you're worried about the safety of a friend or a stranger, it's okay to intervene. 100 years ago, this was considered a private family matter. Right. It's not. It's a crime, and it's everyone's business, or we're going to have, other tragic cases like Yardley Love.
Well, I thought that, and I know in the Fairfax school system, for example, they are doing this sort of bullying training with young children now.
Yes.
Even in the elementary and middle schools. The colleges, I mean, this has been a problem for a long time on colleges. Yeah. They don't have, like, as part of orientation, here's what you do to sort of empower people to say this person is a problem or this person is in trouble. Here's what I do within the school system. Here's how this gets handled. There's not a routine.
Lot emerging right now, and it's only been in the last 5 to 10 years, and a lot of it's funding. So there are campus grants coming out of the Office on Violence Against Women within the Department of Justice, and that's all funded through the Violence Against Women Act. So it all hinges on reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, because it's not just about statutes, it's about the funding that goes with it. Because putting trained advocates and counselors on a college campus who truly understand these issues to staff a women's center, a victim advocacy center, and then go into student orientation and train students, because I was a former resident assistant at Penn State, so I was trained on what to do. But the 70,000 students at Penn State didn't get trained. And so it's reaching beyond just your counselors and advocates and making sure everyone knows what to do and how to intervene if you're concerned about someone's safety.
Well, I will say I'll put in a plug for the Rotary at this point, because we have our club leader training coming up in a couple of weeks, and the new course in that training is not just how do you be a treasurer or how do you be a Rotary president. They're having training on sexual abuse.
Phenomenal.
And every club that deals with youth, which is sort of generally described as like under 21, basically.
Right.
Every club has to have someone trained, has a special officer in their club to be trained on this topic so that it doesn't become an issue. And thankfully, sort of knock on wood, Rotary hasn't had a lot of problems with that. But it is something that you become aware of, and people have to get the training, because there has to be just an enormously helpless feeling if you think it's happening
and you just don't know what to do.
It's like, well, and you said Penn State, which need to go there, with all those folks who did or didn't do what they should or shouldn't have done.
I will say that whole story was incredibly heartbreaking for me, in part because my alma mater, I sort of consider I have two alma maters. Penn State was where I got my undergraduate degree, but I started in this movement at the local domestic violence and rape crisis center across town from Penn State, and I was actually doing child sexual abuse prevention work. So just heartbreaking on so many levels to think of people that I admired didn't know what to do and really didn't step forward when they needed to.
Yeah, it is just incredibly tragic. The whole thing was all the way around.
I will say that one of the things that has happened, and it's absolutely not okay that it takes tragedies, but what has happened over the past 30 years is typically there'll be some wildly popular and earth-shaking tragedy, and then we see social change. So when Nicole Brown Simpson died, we all of a sudden were talking about domestic violence on CNN. Prior to that, it was not a news discussion. It was never on national news. This was a private family matter. It wasn't discussed publicly. We now have television shows, and Mariska Hargitay does a huge amount of work on this issue personally and is on Law and Order Special Victims. But they actually take on these issues. Glee covered domestic violence last week.
Oh my gosh.
So the world is different today than it was 40 years ago, but in part it's because a tragedy occurs and then people rally and say, not again. We've got to do something differently.
Well, and I do remember, for those of you who may have missed Cindy's starring role on Dr. Phil a while ago, he did a whole segment on it was, I guess, dating type relationships. They were younger folks, and it was, do you get out, don't you get out, why are you putting up with this? And you had these girls and their mothers, and the guys would come on, and it was very interesting. And your comments as to what was going on, I thought was really very telling. They were sort of trying to make these girls who were leaving victims, and you made a whole impassioned speech on how it takes a lot of guts to face up to this and to then try and do something about it. And that has to be acknowledged, that it really does take a good deal.
I think there's a myth out there that victims cower in the corner and they're not strong. I think they're stronger than you and me combined, which, on a side note, oh dear God, that's strong. But it's true, because, you know, thinking about what it's like to go through the day with friends and family that love and support you, and then thinking about what it's like to go through the day with someone who is actively sabotaging you at every single moment, and you still get up and you still get through the day somehow despite all of that. And so when people think, oh, domestic violence victims, they're so weak, I'm like, oh no, they're not. They have resilience and inner strength that is just mind-boggling. It's sad that they need to develop that strength. I would love to see them in a place where, you know, they're surrounded by support systems and people that build them up instead of put them down. But they're definitely not cowering.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the support system, because I know there are shelters around in this area. There are a number of shelters, whether they're for homeless or domestic violence. And those, you don't mix. The homeless and domestic violence shelters, are they the same shelters? Are they different?
They're different shelters. However, you'll find that homeless shelters will take battered women in, especially if the domestic violence shelters are overflowing. But having worked at local domestic violence and rape crisis centers, and just, you know, we serve all victims. We serve male victims. We serve gay male victims. We serve women. Statistically, about 85 to 90% of domestic violence victims are women, but men can be abused by their male partners and abused by their female partners. It's just a much smaller percentage. However, if you call a domestic violence shelter or hotline, they are specially trained. So they know these issues. You know, in most states, they have to go through at least 40 hours of training. I went through 70 hours before I picked up my first hotline call in Pennsylvania. So they know the issues quite well. And I encourage, you know, anybody listening, if you're worried about a friend, if you're concerned about your own safety, definitely reach out to a local domestic violence shelter or hotline.
And there's a national hotline, right?
There is. It's 1-800-799-SAFE, S-A-F-E.
All right. Well, we are going to continue when we come back from the break. We're going to talk a little bit about how the shelters in this area work, how to recognize abuse, what to do about it, and technology. Stay with us.
Saving for retirement might be easy for some folk, but for others, it might take a little more work. And for those who haven't started, there are still things you can do to catch up.
Oh, that is good news.
Like getting out from underneath past debt. And don't get wrapped up with high-interest credit cards.
Get you some eyes.
Be diversified with your investments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Your financial goals are not out of reach. The choice is clear. For a happy ending, choose to save.
Everyone with alcohol and drug addiction is in the same boat. With treatment, you can find solid ground. For drug and alcohol information and treatment referral for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP.
Dude, are you sure you want this tattoo? Because just do it.
Some mistakes in life are permanent. Like hearing loss. To learn how to protect your hearing, visit asha.org.
You've probably heard about heart disease, but did you know that it's the #1 killer of women nationwide? Heart disease claims more lives each year than breast cancer, lung cancer, or strokes combined. But there are steps you can take to protect yourself against it. For more information on how you can prevent heart disease, contact your local American Heart Association or visit their website at www.americanheart.org.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton. We are here with Cindy Southworth. We are talking about domestic violence, and when we went to break, we were starting to talk about some of the shelters in this area and how they work. And I wanted to finish that conversation, Cindy, but then I wanted to have you describe for our viewers, if they call that domestic hotline you gave right before we left, or they call their local shelters, what can they expect?
Sure.
So.
Pretty much all over the country, shelters are set up fairly similarly. And I use the term shelter loosely because shelters are so much more than shelter. In fact, when we survey them once a year, and we'll talk about the stats a bit later, we find that shelters about 1/3 of what they do, but they provide transitional housing, court accompaniment, attorneys, counseling, children's group, confidential women's support group. There's all sorts of services, budgeting, immigration support. There's all sorts of other things they do. But so I'll use the term loosely. So when you call the hotline or a shelter, you don't have to give your real name. You can call and just say, I'm calling for a friend, and you don't have to give your friend's name. And I actually encourage people that are worried about a friend or a sister or a loved one to call and say, I'm worried, I'm not sure how to approach this. And it is a little dicey because one of the challenges is if the abuser is doing what is very standard, they're isolating the victim away from their support system. And it starts out by saying, oh, I miss you so much, please don't go out with your friends tonight, I just can't bear to be apart. And then it's I don't like the way your friends treat you, I think they're putting you down, and oh, you know, they're just not a good influence on you. And then it's cranked up to, you know, I really don't think you should spend time with them at all, to then forbidding you to see your friends. So that isolation really puts the victim in a much more vulnerable place, which is all about power and control. However, if you as a friend intervene and come on too strong and too heavy, you may play into the hands of the abuser. Because then the victim may say, wow, this isn't good. I can't spend time with Cindy now because she's judging me. Right. So we encourage, you know, if you're concerned about someone, call a hotline, talk it through, because the best thing you can do for a friend is to be there and not judge them, not put extra pressure on them, because trust me, someone's doing that 24 hours a day. So to have a warm, supportive friend who just believes in them and provides genuine compliments and supports her, typically, it also can happen to men, is going to be one of the best things you can do.
That's got to be really difficult, though, because, or it may just be that, as my friends lovingly say, I'm a bit directive. It would be very hard to see somebody that you think is being abused. You see somebody trying to isolate them. You see somebody being highly critical, to not basically say, have you lost your mind? What are you staying in this relationship for?
Rent the U-Haul and decide to pack them up and move them out. Right. And take control. So,
yes, I got it. I got that. Okay, power and control with the abuser, and now your friend's coming in.
And swooping in.
Swooping in with the same thing. Different take.
But you do need support, because having been in that position where I was just dreadfully worried about a friend, and it was heartbreaking the amount of support I needed so that I can continue to be this warm, supportive sounding board, hang up the phone, and then call another friend and say, oh my God, I'm terrified, and here's why. And it was so that I could continue to be there, and eventually with enough support and warmth and non-judgmental, when she was ready to break things off, we safety planned, because I was really concerned about what was going to happen. And so we went through so what happens if he shows up? What if he says, I'm going to kill myself? You know, you call 911 because you're worried about your current partner or your ex, you know, but it's not that you choose to stay with them because they pulled the I'm going to kill myself card, which tragically happens. Some abusers not only threaten to kill themselves, you know, murder-suicide is all too common. If I can't have you, no one's going to have you, and then I'm going to take my own life too. So we take those threats very seriously, but we can talk through, what do you do if someone, you know, says, I'm going to kill myself? What do you do? How do you handle that? And so back to, if you call a local hotline, you can use a fake name. You don't have to give them your real name. Even if they ask it, they have no right to have your real name. You can go through everything happening in your life, talk about why you're concerned about your relationship, maybe some of the things that are happening that have you worried, and just talk it through. In an ideal world, they're not going to put pressure on you to do anything. They're not going to try to encourage you to leave, or force you to get a protection order. They're just there to give you options. And then you know your situation better than anyone else, and you can figure out which steps to take.
Now, do they ever, or is there some law that prohibits them, if I were to call a domestic violence hotline, I would be concerned, because if I call you, it comes up and says it's Bettina Lawton on the phone. So I could call a domestic hotline and say, you know, my name is Annie Oakley, But they're looking really, because it says Bettina Lawton right on the screen. Is what you say to them absolutely confidential? Do they have an obligation to call the police or protective services or any of that kind of stuff on you?
If you're an adult victim, in most states in the United States, they cannot call anybody, which I'm separating that because child abuse is a different issue. But as an adult victim of domestic violence, most domestic violence advocates all over the country are legally mandated to protect your confidentiality. And it's in state statutes. Pennsylvania has advocate privilege. In some states, that advocate privilege is almost as strong as attorney privilege. Wow. It's incredibly strong. And it's so that you feel comfortable calling that shelter. You may not feel comfortable disclosing to anyone else in your life, but that hotline needs to be a safe space. And in Virginia, they modeled their confidentiality statute after what's in the Violence Against Women Act, which basically prohibits them from giving your name, your date of birth, your social number, your race, your ethnicity, your IP address, your fax number. They can't give anything out with your signed, time-limited, and informed consent. So I might want you to make a call on my behalf, but I have to sign a waiver and allow for it. Okay. So if you're concerned, if you call a hotline and Bettina Lawton shows up and they say, well, are you really Bettina? First of all, you can lie and say, no, I'm using her phone.
That's right.
They shouldn't even ask. But if they did, you don't have to tell them. They're there to be a warm, supportive place, to tell you about your options, to talk about safety, and then you figure out what steps are next. Because ultimately, all abusers are different, and every victim knows their situation better than anyone else. Sometimes a protection order is life-saving, other times it's that last straw that can escalate things even more, and a victim's going to know better than anyone else their own situation.
Now, how much do protective orders help? Because it's a piece of paper.
There's been some good studies. The University of Kentucky did a study recently on protection order effectiveness, and it was really positive. We were all quite pleased to see that there is some positive impact. It's not in every case, because if an abuser has no concern about violating an order or going to jail, they have nothing to lose, then it's a piece of paper. But if the offender is a school principal or has an upstanding job in the community and really doesn't want the conviction or the publicity, that piece of paper can be incredibly useful. It also sends a strong message that the community does not condone this behavior. So unlike 100 years ago when this was just considered what happened and well, keep your wife in line, now it's like, no, you cannot do this to anybody in your life, including the person you're supposed to love. And it's, you have the sheriffs that serve the order, then you have the police that enforce it, and the prosecutors that charge if it's violated, and then the judge that sentences. So there's a lot of people telling an offender this is unacceptable behavior in 2012. You cannot do this.
Are protective orders public? So if somebody got one, everybody else could know about it?
Again, depends on the state. They are often public but not published. So if you were to go into the courthouse, you may be able to get your hands on a copy, but if you're a victim and you go in and file for an order, it's not going to be on the evening news in most cases. Okay. So I don't want a victim to think, oh, I can't go get one. At the same time, it is a public court document in most states. New York, it's not a public court document. They treat it more like family law cases, and they keep all of that semi-locked down, but it's still a court record. And so that's something that attorneys and advocates will help a victim think about, is if you have years and years and years of really horrific things that have happened, punches and other things, do you need to put the marital rape in your petition for protection? It's up to you. That's something very sensitive, very personal. If you don't want to put it in writing and put it in the court document, that's your choice. Talk it over with an attorney, because if you leave it out and then you decide to go to the prosecutor later, you're an attorney, you want to make sure you're navigating those waters, but at the same time, it is a public document.
Okay, now you distinguish between adult victims and child victims, and that's a completely different kind of system. When it's a child, there's the mandatory reporting and things like that. So
in most states, most practitioners, in fact the general public in a lot of states, are mandatory reporters of suspected child abuse. And in my case as a social worker, I need to know the victim, the offender, what happened, et cetera, and then I would be a mandatory reporter. From a domestic violence standpoint, we train advocates that work at the shelters, not only here in the metro area, but nationwide, to work with the domestic violence survivor, work with the battered woman on that. If a woman comes in and discloses to me, and I've had this, that her husband was holding the baby outside the second floor window, just
it's Michael Jackson.
Heartbreaking, right? Heartbreaking, right? And And what I need to do is a report needs to be made at that point, but I don't have to do it. And so what we can do is sit down together and I can help her make that phone call. And then she shows Child Protective Services that she is the protective parent. She is trying to keep her child safe. So, in many cases, even though a report has to be made, I can facilitate it occurring, make sure it occurs, but make sure that the battered woman is part of it. Because the last thing you want to have happen when your life's already chaotic is to have more control ripped away.
Right.
And so we encourage advocates to work with the victim on how to make sure those reports are made appropriately.
And are there statistics that say if a man is abusing the wife and there are kids in the house, how often does that travel down towards the kids? Is there a correlation? You're abusing the wife, eventually you're going to get to the kids, or no?
Very much. I mean, it's a co-occurrence situation that, one of the things they found, Susan Schechter, who's one of the leaders of our field, who sadly died of cancer a few years ago, she actually went into the hospitals in Massachusetts and realized that if she was going in there and dealing with kids who had come in with broken arms and other suspicious cases, if she pulled the mothers aside privately, the majority of them were domestic violence survivors. So she created this really unique program where, while they were treating the kids for physical injuries, they were talking to mom in a private, secure setting and saying, how can we help you and your children? And once they wrapped around and gave the woman and children some safety options, everybody was safer. So there's sort of a saying that, safe moms mean safe kids. Right. And, the solution is not to rip kids away from their mothers, it's to make sure everybody is safe.
Now, I would think, because if you're talking about power and control and the abuser's need for power and control, that in circumstances that we have now, where the economy is not so great, people are losing their jobs, they're losing their homes to foreclosure, all these terrible things are happening that are out of their control, I would expect domestic abuse to go up. Is there a correlation in that respect?
There is a correlation, and part of it is if you've got a perfectly healthy, warm, supportive, loving relationship, and the economy tanks, you lose your job, it may make things rocky. It's not necessarily going to make you a physical or emotional abuser. But if you're already controlling, if there's already domestic violence going on, and you're already choosing to misuse power over your partner, and then you lose your job, yowzers, it's like putting gasoline on a fire. So a good economy doesn't end domestic violence, and a bad economy does not explicitly cause it. It definitely exacerbates it. So what we see right now is our shelters, the phones are ringing off the hook, and the stays are longer, the need is up, the demand is up. So we're definitely seeing an impact of the economy.
Okay. Well, we're going to be going to a break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk with Cindy about technology and how it's used in the domestic violence field. So stay with us, and more coming.
Too many women get hit by their boyfriends and husbands. Too many women are pressured into having unprotected sex. Half of the people in the world living with AIDS are women. It doesn't have to be this way. Together, we can change this reality. Let's strive for a world free of violence.
At Volunteers of America, we don't just give kids a way to stay off the streets. We give them the tools they need to reach their full potential. We don't just help the elderly receive needed care. We help them live life to the fullest. We don't just provide food for homeless individuals and families. We provide job training and placement so they can buy groceries. Volunteers of America is a national organization that for over 100 years has provided programs and services that allow people to overcome their challenges to become vital members of their community. At Volunteers of America, we don't just help people, we help people help themselves. Find out how you can support the programs that are working in your community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
Drivers face all kinds of distractions.
Guys, stop playing. No. 127 consecutive.
Before your wireless phone becomes one of them, stop. Drive safely. Keep your phone in easy reach and dial sensibly. In bad weather or traffic, call later and use a hands-free device. Remember, with wireless, safety is your call.
Would you notice if you were missing half your...
To the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, and I'm here with Cindy Southworth, and we are talking about domestic violence. And there were a couple of statistics that we talked about before we went on that I thought were just amazing. And one of them is the number of victims that are served in one day. And you related it to the size, I think, of the Ravens football stadium in one day.
In one day. We do a study once a year, actually. It's the Domestic Violence Counts, the National Census of Domestic Violence Services. So we're not doing a prevalence or incident study. This isn't about how many people experience violence in a day, but it is how many reach out for help, and how many are coming to local shelters in Alexandria and Leesburg and Fairfax and all over the United States in one 24-hour period. And what we found is that in one day, September 15th of 2011, 67,399 adults and children were helped by local domestic violence hotlines and shelters around the country. And that's the size of Candlestick Park, 49ers Stadium, Ravens Stadium, Seahawks Seattle. That's the size. Every single seat in the entire stadium filled with an adult or child survivor of domestic violence. It is just staggering.
It's enormous. But it's not... There's still another more than 10,000 a day that can't be helped because the resources aren't there.
Right.
So
and
they
so
reach out and they don't get any
And
help.
think about that. It's just the courage it takes to call a perfect stranger, to call the 1-800-799-SAFE, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, or your local hotline, and tell a perfect stranger about some very personal things happening in your life, and to ask for a shelter bed, or ask if they have an attorney available, or a counselor that they can meet with, or someone to go to court with them, to get up that courage, and then to have the advocate on the other end say, I am so sorry, but we just don't have anyone. And what we found is that on average, we spend 41 minutes when we say no. We don't just hang up the phone. We try to find them bed space somewhere else. We try to find them a counselor, an attorney. So it's not like we say, no, I'm so sorry, and hang up. And so advocates are spending a lot of time trying to find resources for those unmet requests. But 10,581 times on September 15th, 2011, 10,581 times someone had to say, I am so sorry. And I think one time is too many. And we need to get that number way down. But that number has spiked a bit since last year. That's one thing we're seeing. The demand is up, resources down, giving is down. When people, with their financial strain is up, people aren't giving as much to their local shelters. The National Network Domestic Violence needs your donations more now than ever, because it's, the economy's really had an impact on all of our work.
Now, this is a lot of victims. And we talked at the top of the show that domestic violence doesn't necessarily mean someone's hitting you, that it's about power, it's about control. But sometimes the women, or those few instances of men, are actually killed. How many people get killed in a year attributed to violence from the intimate partner?
It's way too many, and it's on average 3 women a day are killed by an intimate partner. So it's about 1,200 women every year. And we've made some progress. It used to be consistently about 1,500 women every year were killed by intimate partners. And since we've founded shelters and passed laws and passed the Violence Against Women Act, we brought that number down to around 1,200 to 1,300. It sort of fluctuates in there. But okay, so that's 200 to 300 more women that are alive this year than 20 years ago, but that's not enough. We need to really lower those numbers. Ironically, what number has reduced dramatically from all of the work we've been doing for 20-some years is the number of abusers being killed by their victims has gone way down. And so a couple of years ago, the Baltimore Sun did a headline and said, "Battered Women's Movement is saving the lives of abusers." And we all got a chuckle out of it. But what it means is that women years ago thought they had no options. There were no laws, there were no shelters, there were no protection orders. The police wouldn't come, and if they did, they would make the abuser walk around the block and say, cool down a bit and then go back in. And now they arrest the abuser, hold him accountable, take him to jail, and have a judge who's trained on domestic violence sentencing. And so what we found is that more abusers are alive today because victims have options, which also means that victims aren't spending their lives in jail, which is a phenomenal success too. And we don't advocate homicide ever, so we're thrilled that women don't feel that they have no choice.
Well, let's talk about technology, because that's your special passion, expertise, and what's out there. You see and you read about people who are tracing other folks through their Facebook accounts, or they're hacking into their emails. I mean, what is it when abusers on the abuser side? What do the abusers use technology to do that's new and different from what was available 10, 15 years ago?
I mean, pretty much as we all move to a digital world, we all carry lots of technology devices. Abusers use the tools that are around. And so 100 years ago, I'm guessing they were using whatever technology was current of the day, perhaps the telegraph, but they were using whatever tools were there. And so now that we are all carrying smartphones, guess what? Abusers are texting and threatening with smartphones. You know, shocking. They're using the tools at their disposal. And so 20 years ago, when I first started this work, abusers would frequently tell their victims, you're not allowed to leave the house today. You can't even go to the grocery store without my permission. Just absolute control. And when they would come home at the end of the day, they would check the odometer on the car to see if indeed she'd had the audacity to go buy milk. And if she had, she would pay for it. And so now they don't use the odometer on the car, they don't need to. They can use a tracking device installed on the car, a GPS tracking device, or they can use an application that is designed by some really nefarious and soulless individuals on how to spy on your spouse and your partner. There's actually apps being developed and marketed to spy on someone.
Oh my gosh.
And you know, and unfortunately, I will say that happily we're working with the main carriers and main tech companies, and they do have souls and they have consciences, and they work very closely with us. Verizon, Microsoft, Google, we're on the Facebook Safety Advisory Board, and they frequently come to us and say, how can we make sure that our technology not only is helpful for all women, but we minimize the risk of it being misused and harmed by stalkers and abusers. So we give a lot of advice, and we test out features and give some advice off behind the scenes for a lot of those companies. So the reputable companies are not developing stalking apps, but the rogue app developers are, or a handful are.
That's just absolutely amazing that somebody would actually do that. Now, can they track you? I know, you always see it on television, and I'm never quite sure whether it's all just fake because it's television or the technology really exists. But if somebody wanted to track where I was, and they're not the police, they don't have a warrant to do it, they're just, some guy, can they do that? I mean, I have a smartphone. Can people actually track me with my smartphone?
Well, and it comes down to knowing what's on your phone. And so when Google rolled out Latitude, which lets you voluntarily share information with your friends about your location, which can be really fun, it needs to let you know what's happening. And so when they asked us to test it out, I said, can you put a splash screen up, a notification that it pops up? Because I said, if I leave my purse unattended and someone gets to my BlackBerry and turns on Latitude and shares, turns on the location sharing on my smartphone, I won't know what's turned on unless there's a pop-up notification or a text message or something. So a lot of the carriers and companies have come to us, and we've given them some suggestions on make sure it's transparent, make sure that the user knows that their location is being shared. The iPhone, you can check which applications are currently sharing location. Because if you're a stalking victim or a domestic violence victim, your abusive controlling partner has a lot of access to your smartphone. And so, if you're in doubt, if you're worried that someone's tracking you right now, pop the battery out. If the battery is pulled from your phone, it is not tracking you right now. The challenge is a lot of victims are under such severe control, and if anything changes, they pay for it. So it's sometimes safer to let the battery run out. Oops, it died. I forgot to charge it. And that may be safer than willfully, intentionally popping the battery. But what we recommend all victims do is get to know their phones. Know what features they have, know if location sharing is turned on. And they may not be able to turn it off safely, but they may be able to leave it at home when they go meet with the attorney. I left my phone at home, it happens, I was racing out of the house, the kids were crying, oops, forgot it.
Right.
So there's ways to navigate, because one thing we find with stalking is it starts during the relationship, it escalates at breakup, and it continues long after. Domestic violence doesn't end when you break up. In fact, separation violence is a term that's used to talk about how the risk of injury and death increases at breakup. So when people say, why doesn't she just leave? Well, sometimes leaving may be the most dangerous thing to do. So it's not that we discourage it, but we want you to safety plan. Talk to an advocate, talk to friends, talk to an attorney, think through how to leave to make it as safe as possible.
Now, do you have, I remember, and It might have been you. Setting your location, like in South America someplace, to see if it would work.
I frequently set my location to exotic locales. If I don't have time to travel, at least I can fake it on my my Google latitude. Yes. So,
all your friends think you're someplace great, but you're really not.
Yes, I think I'm not sure where I'm at currently, but it's possibly Lisbon. It changes frequently, but so you can fake your location, and that's a feature we actually really like for victims of domestic violence, because they could fake their location and put that they're currently at home when they're really meeting with a victim advocate. Of course, it means the abuser could say they're at work when they're really getting ready to come home and do harm. So it's got a flip side. And for those of us that are not in danger, you could set it to be that you're homesick when you're really fishing. So, you know, there are some great features.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
So other than smartphones, and you mentioned GPS tracking devices, so anybody can go out and buy a GPS tracking device and stick it on your car?
Technically, yes. It's a little bit, a wee bit illegal, but yes, it is technically possible. And then spyware is one of the other really big risk areas that we see, and it's computer monitoring. And it's computer monitoring software and hardware. And more abusers, it's all about control. They want to know every email coming in, going out, every password, every PIN number. They want to know what website she's visiting. And so our recommendation to survivors is if someone knows too much about your computer activities or your location or your phone calls, it's entirely possible they've installed some sort of technology device or are monitoring your technology, and they do know too much. And so, and the piece is, abusers can't help but tip their hand. It's all about control. And so just knowing where the victim goes all day long isn't enough. They have to taunt her with that information. Why were you at the post office? Oh, look at those boots you were looking at on the computer yesterday. You know we can't afford those boots. How would you know? So, again, if your partner is taunting you with information they shouldn't have, trust your instincts. And, reach out from a safe phone, from a safe computer, perhaps one at the library. Don't use your home computer to research domestic violence if you think there's any chance that the abuser's monitoring it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please don't come to our website from a computer you think is compromised.
Now, what kind of technology can the victims use to try and protect themselves or to intercept what's happening or whatever?
And part of it is just digital evidence, because 20, 30 years ago, most people committed domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking with no witnesses, with no audience. It was behind closed doors, and so when it came time to going to court or talking to the police, it was really the victim's word and a lot of pressure on her, and digital evidence does not lie. And so if you're going to stalk your partner, please do it on Facebook, because then I have a digital trail and we can prosecute you.
So it does work both ways.
It does.
Well, we're going to talk some more about that and what happens in court and how the technology can help with all of that. So stay with us for our final segment with Cindy Southworth.
Some dreams are universal. Dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton. This is our final segment with Cindy Southworth. When we left, we were talking about technology and how it can help domestic violence victims. And we want to continue on with that and see what else they can do. You were talking about evidence, that this actually gives, it's not a he said, she said, and you actually can have some proof. And do people actually use, I mean, this is showing my naivete, but they actually harass people on Facebook? It's not just the teenager type stuff you read about?
Well, and domestic violence, again, is about power and control, my mantra, but it's also about sort of entitlement and feeling entitled to treat your partner this way. It's not an anger problem. Domestic violence is not about anger, because if it was uncontrollable anger, they would punch the taxi driver, they would punch their boss, they would punch the person on the street. It's very calculated. They wait till they get home because you're allowed. You know, we've got millions of years of patriarchy that we're undoing, and we're making progress, but abusing your partner, your spouse, is condoned and acceptable. We're quickly changing, we're slowly changing that. But when it comes to technology, abusers have this phenomenal arrogance and entitlement of, like, not only do I get to control you at the home, I'm going to control you on Facebook. You know, you left me, but I'm going to put my threats out there for the world to see. And we're seeing that be considered a violation of a protection order. Of course it is. You're not only having contact, and when the judge said I said no contact, I meant no contact, including through Facebook or Twitter or email or phone calls or text messages. So judges are seeing that for what it is, which is communication, which was disallowed. And a threat is a threat, whether you put it on a computer or you do it in person. It's, you know, a terroristic threat or whatever it is in your state.
Mm-hmm. And you said a lot of these laws are state-based laws.
Yes. Most times you're going to see domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault. Most of these crimes are prosecuted at the state level, so it's going to be your state law that applies versus the federal law. There are occasional federal cases brought forward, but it's a lot more complex, and you're bringing in the FBI and the U.S. attorneys. But most domestic violence cases are prosecuted as misdemeanors for the assault charges, although we'll see harassment, stalking cases, and now that we're seeing so much more technology being woven in, and I never see a case that's just about technology. It's about domestic violence in person, the threats, and then the technology. But you may have a technology crime in addition, so eavesdropping. Installing an eavesdropping device. If you put spyware on your victim's computer and intercept electronic communications, that's wiretap, that's eavesdropping.
Wow.
And so we've seen some felony convictions using wiretap and technology laws where the physical abuse may have only ranked up to a misdemeanor. So we encourage police to really creatively look at what's on the code book, because depending on what form of technology they're misusing, there may be additional charges.
Oh, that's an interesting way of stepping it up, because having it be a misdemeanor doesn't sound like a lot. Doesn't sound like it's going to necessarily persuade somebody that they shouldn't be doing this.
Well, and it doesn't sound like society takes it very seriously.
Right.
You know, it's you know, disturbing that computer crime has, you know, higher penalties than putting your partner in intensive care. But if it takes packaging that all together to get a decent sentence, then it sends a stronger message.
And how many cases actually go to court? I mean, is that a typical resolution, or is it the victim gets away, there's some period of continuing harassment, as you were talking about, and then it stops? I mean, how do these cases ultimately end?
I mean, a lot of the challenge with domestic violence is if you have shared children, it doesn't really end ever. I mean, you've got the family wedding when the kids are in their 30s where you still have to deal with your ex. I mean, so technically you may be living day in and day out in a much safer way. You may not be looking over your shoulder as much, but it's not necessarily over because there's, you know, shared parenting and shared children involved. It definitely doesn't end when the breakup happens. I mean, that's a real myth that if you just break up, it's happy, hunky-dory, and why don't victims just leave? In reality, it probably is going to get far worse at breakup. And often, people aren't in an abusive relationship. They're not being abused because they sat down one day and said, you know, gee, I think I want to date an abuser. That sounds fun. Instead, they're charming, fabulous partners that come on and do flowers and poems and great dates, and slowly over time they isolate you away from all your friends, and then slowly start demeaning you. But by the time you're there and you realize what's happening, your family and friends are gone. You know, you've lost your job, or your abuser has convinced you that you should quit and be home with the kids because of, or whatever, just moved you away from your career. So the reality is, no one wants their loved one to go to jail. No one wants to call the police on someone they've married, someone they chose to be with, someone who was really wonderful at one point. So all of the criminal justice and civil justice system is very complex for victims, and we get that. I mean, it's one part of the response, it's not everything. Economic justice is a big focus of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, because if women have access to income, they have more options. And so the police is one piece, but it's not the only piece. Housing, safe, affordable housing for victims means victims have more choices and options. So we look at a holistic response. The faith community, family, friends, everybody needs to be involved and make a difference, because it's really hard to go to court and testify against someone who you love or loved at one point.
Right, which is kind of the underlying theme, and you've said at various times, you know, someone that you love, and every time you said it, I was kind of like, yeah, but they're abusing you. It's kind of, you don't.
And they don't abuse 24 hours a day. I wish someone would come up to me and say, Cindy, I'd love to go on a date tonight, and just to let you know, in about 5 months, I'm gonna punch you. That would, full disclosure, just tell me now. Someday I'm gonna try to control everything you do and where. Do you wanna have dinner? It would be so much easier, but they don't come in that way. They come in fabulous and charming, like someone who's not abusive. And so it's really hard to know who is an abuser. And people that say, oh, you can do a background check, the majority of abusers are never convicted. So ultimately, when women say, you know, how do you know? First of all, you trust your instincts. If, you know, you have to miss a date because you're helping out a friend and you're, watch the reaction. Is your, you know, new fabulous honey, okay, I'm disappointed, but you know, your friends matter? Or are they pouting and freaking out because you went out to have a drink with a girlfriend at work? You know, what's that reaction like? Watch those reactions. Do they try to control what you wear and who you see and what you do? Trust your gut. And you don't have to call it domestic violence. It may not have escalated to that yet, but it's just not a healthy relationship. And it's okay to end it, because even though they're wonderful on one level, they're trying to control you on another. And no one, you know, no one deserves to be controlled by a partner.
The ones that I think are really insidious in a lot of ways are not the ones who are trying to control you the 24 hours a day, or not obviously.
Right.
So you think it's good. Something happens and you're like, oh, this is a good time. And I have friends who have said, you know, it was great. All of a sudden, you know, whatever, he got a new job, he did this, he got a new church, and we had this great 6 months. And that's how come Johnny exists, because we had this great 6 months. And then he went back to being horrendous. And then he was really good again. And so that was sort of a...
There's one model called the cycle of violence out there, and they talk about that honeymoon phase, and not all victims experience it, but it makes sense from a pragmatic standpoint. If you get horrible and are really escalating and violent, she's going to leave you. Logic. So you better do something, or the relationship's over, because people aren't abusing their partners because they hate their partner. They're abusing their partner because they want to have control over them. They don't want her to go. So if you keep up that 24-hour-a-day, every single day level of intensity, she's likely going to leave. So frequently we'll see that, you know, the flowers, the honeymoon phase, the things get better for a bit, which is, you know, really crazy making, because things did get better. And that's great. I mean, I have no judgment there, but it's ultimately part of the bigger tactic and strategy is, how do you keep this partner under your thumb? It's you don't let it get so bad that they leave.
Right. Yeah, because then you have to go find somebody new, and that's a lot of work.
Right, to find a new partner to control, absolutely.
So other than sort of watching what your partner does when you have disappointed them, or said that you can't do whatever it is they want, I mean, what are other things you should look for? If you're just in a regular, what you think is a regular relationship, when you say trust your gut, what is it your gut should be listening to so that you should trust it?
Well, and part of it, and there's these two wheels that were developed many, many years ago. One of them is the power and control wheel, and it was developed in talking with victims, with women. And then the other one was the equality wheel. And what it's about is equality is not the absence of violence. It's shared decision making. It's shared power. And so I will never be a yard work kind of girl. Not into nature, not my thing. But do I have equal power in the relationship? Do I get to make equal amounts of decisions? And so you can choose in any relationship to divide up chores and life and duties and all that stuff differently. But ultimately, does your opinion matter? And it can be the simplest things about where we're going for dinner, or the big things about where we're moving to for which person's career. Does your voice matter in that relationship? And whether it's a 2-week relationship or a 20-year relationship, is it equal? And it doesn't mean the same, because different people have different strengths, passions, hobbies, and allergies. But is it equal?
All right, and so that's what you have to keep looking towards and recognizing. I think one of the things that's really important for people to recognize is that it isn't necessarily physically beating you up.
Correct.
That it's the power, the control, it's the demeaning, it's the verbs,
the threats,
and all of that good kind of stuff.
All of that.
So it's an amazing thing. Now, with the the Violence Against Women Act and the reauthorization, what happens if it's not reauthorized?
It comes up for reauthorization every 5 years, and essentially the law components that are in there stay. So the legal changes that happened in 2000 to allow immigrant victims who moved here perhaps with their spouse, maybe working in the tech industry in Silicon Valley or here in our Reston sort of Herndon technology belt. A victim might be married to a technology person, and if they leave their abusive partner, historically they would have been deported immediately. Wow. So the Violence Against Women Act allows a victim who's here because they're married, and the partner's here for a work visa, they can stay and go get counseling and help, and then eventually file paperwork to stay here on their own. Otherwise, it disincentivizes them to ever leave someone dangerous. Right. And so that law changed in 2000, and we've done some tweaking over the years to improve it, enhance it, figure out the paperwork process a little bit better, but that legal piece doesn't go away when the Violence Against Women Act expires, but all the funding does. So the funding for the campus programs to prevent another Yardley Love disaster and tragedy, the campus to train, the funding to train police and prosecutors and judges, all that money goes away. The funding for shelters and victim advocates and sexual assault service providers, that money's gone. So if we let it expire, we are essentially putting very critical life-saving services in jeopardy, and we can't let it expire. So it's passed in the Senate. There's several House bills. Some of them have much stronger protections for all victims than others. The one that we really are supporting are one that makes sure that Native victims on tribal lands, that they're safe, that make sure immigrant victims are safe, that make sure LGBT victims are safe. We want all victims safe.
Okay, and so people who are out there and concerned about this, they need to get a hold of their congressmen and women and say reauthorize it, so that we don't end up with, as we say, the equivalents of Candlestick Park not being able to get help when they desperately need it and have had the courage to call and ask. So, we thank you for watching. Cindy Southworth, Domestic Violence, the National Network to End Domestic Violence. Contribute. Thanks.
Thanks.